Bonga, thank you for that interesting dialogue and narrative. One has to understand these events. As we said at the beginning of this discussion, we're trying to reconstruct what happened in circumstances where you have an alien force, the British, who have their agenda they are pursuing. And we have actors on the ground, the Awolowos, the Azikiwes, the Ojukwus, the Sadanas. It's almost like actors in a Shakespearean play. The only party that knows the real story, the real plot, is Shakespeare himself, i.e. Britain. And with their powers of influence, coercion, we end up in a situation where there's a high degree of confusion as to what was really going on, what is the real story. Now, you're right that Awolowo all the while was seeking an alliance with the East. And he said that repeatedly, even up into the run-up of independence. And then we see a change. We see Awolowo going into accepting appointment as the Commissioner of Finance in the federal military government. Shortly, in fact, it was shortly before the onset of hostilities. Now, let's bring some context in. Awolowo had been jailed. His beloved Western region had been set afire in Operation Weti. It was a civil war. The background to that, if you remember earlier in our discussions today, was fisticuffs, i.e. just a fight, physical fights between members of the House of Assembly, the Western Region House of Assembly. And I explained right at the beginning of this discussion that when somebody asked me about dates and their significance, I explained that when you looked at that event in isolation, it looked straightforward, innocuous. There was a fight amongst parliamentarians. Central government declares a state of emergency and takes over the Western region and sends northern troops in to effectively occupy, your martial law in the Western region. Awolowo ends up in prison. All looks innocuous, straightforward, just local events that are shaping what's happening. And then if you remember, if you were here, I explained when you then factor in that state of emergency was declared on the 29th of May, 1962. And then you understand that the 29th of May is a significant date in the Caliphate's calendar, such that all the key strategic moves by the Caliphate against other elements in the Nigerian political union take place on the 29th of May, or if not the 29th of May, on the 29th of some other month. You begin now to see the fingerprints of the center on what looks like a local incident. You then begin to, if you then follow the conspiracy theory, and I do believe in conspiracy theories, not all of them, but let nobody ever simply, don't allow anybody to take you off the scent by simply shouting conspiracy theory. Because it may be a conspiracy theory, but it may be a theory that can be validated when you really look at it. And so what you then see is a plot by the federal government to take Awolowo off the political stage. They now come up with a plot that he was organizing a coup, and they charge him with treason. He and Enahuru are locked up for many, many years. All of a sudden, the main political force in the Western region leaves the stage. And in his place emerges Akintola, who is much more ready to play along with the central agenda and goes into alliance with the North effectively. So there's Awolowo locked up in prison. And bear in mind, the government that locked him up was an alliance government of the MPC, the North, and the NCNC, as equates NCNC, the East. So there's a poke in the eye, as it were, or a stab in the back, as it will be perceived. He ends up in prison. What then happens, he's still in prison when the coup happens, and I think he was still in prison when the counter coup happened. And then Gowon releases him from prison. Remember, there's always a bit of controversy as to who actually released him from prison. Was it Ojukwu, or was it Gowon? Well, it's actually in Ojukwu's own book, titled "Because I Am Involved." That is where you find the evidence of Ojukwu himself saying it was Gowon who released Awolowo. Now, I forget the length of the prison sentence that Awolowo was due to serve, still many, many years to serve. But now he is released. You could be sure that the release wasn't out of the goodness of the heart of Gowon, thinking that his original imprisonment was somehow wrong. It was strategic. You create a sense of indebtedness, obligation. This is the power game that's being played. So he will have sympathies for Gowon and time for him in those circumstances. And then, in terms of the discussion with Ojukwu regarding the secession move, it is covered in Fatherless. I don't think your group has actually got to that stage yet, but at page 264, you'll find a discussion between Awolowo and Ojukwu. And because Awolowo was always very careful and suspicious, he always used to avoid meeting, when it comes to very important meetings, meeting on a one-to-one basis. You confirmed in your reading there that he always insists on something, some record or some other independent witness being available. And so they had that discussion where, concerning the East plan to pull out, and Awolowo made his position clear that the West was in no position to pull out with the East, because the West was still under military occupation. It had been ever since he was in prison. Now he was released. The West did not have troops of their own. And so he said to Ojukwu, as I said at page 264, look, I've been sent here to try and talk you into coming back to the negotiation table. It will be something near fraud for us to sit down here and discuss in terms of the South, especially as this delegation was sent here by a body consistent of the Northern delegation. He was always very proper, if you like, in his approach to issues. careful in his approach and proper in his conduct. And there's another passage that I quoted where I went on to say, Awolowo's concern to ensure that any discussion with Ojukwu with a view to a common front for the South was in the open was hardly surprising, given that barely 9 months had elapsed since he was released on a pardon from the government that he was representing at this meeting, from a long term of imprisonment following a conviction for treason. What the transcript of the parley shows is Awolowo making it clear that with the Western region and Lagos still under northern military occupation, the Yoruba were not ready to follow the Igbos if they decided to go ahead with secession. And then I quote from Awolowo's account where he says, and I may say this, and I may say in this connection of Southern solidarity, I'm sorry to go into what happened in the past. In 1953, there was an understanding between the banned NCNC and the banned Action Group. We entered into an agreement, which I hope we will use sometime, to the effect that if the North remained intransigent, that we would declare a Southern Dominion. This was signed by myself and Zeke, and I still stand by it. But we prefer that you should send your delegates to this meeting so that we should, known to everyone, enter into negotiations amongst ourselves and present a common front to the North. Then nobody can accuse us of conspiracy or trying to divide the country into two parts. I want you to look at it from our point of view. If there were no northern soldiers in the West, the position would be different. And even if by the time I return home, the northern soldiers have gone, I still do not want to be accused of perfidy. The issue at hand is not enough for us to say we do not like the North. So when he then, as you say he then goes back to Lagos after that discussion, and he joins he accepts the appointment of as Federal Commissioner for Finance. Was that a betrayal? I don't think so. I've explained the context. When you are released in those circumstances, you are slightly beholden. And if they then offer you a position to say, come and help us run the economy, as it were, you can't, I don't think it would be fair to dump too hard on Awolowo in those circumstances, given that it was an alliance government of the NCNC and the NPC that had jailed him in the first instance and has set his Western region on fire, effectively deposed him. It's difficult to see it as to classify it as a betrayal. He was clear as to what his position was, that the West was in no position to leave. It was tried to persuade Ojukwu to not to go. But obviously the Eastern experience was not the same as the experience of the West. The West had not suffered the pogroms that the East have suffered. Not just 1, 2, 3, on a huge scale. So they weren't seeing things through the same lenses. Understandable. And then as Awolowo pointed out, the East still had, even though most of its senior military figures had been wiped out, in the Ikeja barracks in the counter coup of 29th of July, still the East had a significant, or at least had a presence in the army. They had, and the Eastern region was not under military occupation, whereas the West, they had nothing. northern troops occupying the west, and the Yoruba had been shut out of the army, and so they were in no position to follow the same route. So no betrayal. I hope that answers your point.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.